Hello, BookTube. As I mentioned, I am getting mail still. At least a little. I'm kind of amazed. I don't expect it to last for long because sooner or later, shipping and receiving departments, which are actually all populated by human beings, are going to stop. They're going to shut down, I would think. But I'll take it. I'll take it while I can get it. And I thought we'd go through one of the pieces of mail that I got today, the latest TLS. This is the Times Literary Supplement in its new design. And it had some interesting bits and pieces in it that I wanted to show you. We don't have to go through everything. This doesn't have to be a huge video. The centerpiece, the big opening double-paged item here, is by Francis Wilson, and it's a review of a big new biography by Nikolai Tolstoy of Patrick O'Brian, the writer Patrick O'Brian. And the new book, the subtitle is A Very Private Life, and it's 600 pages. I don't think it's come out in America, and I don't think it's scheduled to anytime soon. But the subtitle says it all for me. The review is very good. With a book like this, you pretty much have to just give a recension of the book. There's not much you can do, especially when there's been, I think, only one other Patrick O'Brian biography, so it's not like you're talking about a tradition. And it's not like this figure belongs to history yet. So it's not like if someone wrote a new biography of Samuel Johnson, you can't really weigh in unless you know the intestate stories of the documents and the family and whatnot. This is the subtitle for me says it all. This is not really a figure that I want to read about. I don't really want to read his life in the way that I want to read a life of many other literary figures. I don't know why that is exactly, except that it seems so out of keeping with his own wishes. And also the presses that I've read of his life in reviews like this and other pieces has made the life sound pretty boring, which is a drastic counterpoint with the story. So I thought the review was really good, but the review is 2 whole pages. What is this? 6 columns of prose. This is plenty for me in terms of the book. I don't need to read any more about the book than that. Then we got the letters page, which was the usual TLS mix of funny and snotty and whatnot. There's a letter here from a writer in London about Will Self. The novelist Will Self has written a memoir. And in a recent piece, he mentioned plagiarizing his own work, plagiarizing himself. And the author of the letter writes, Will Self writes about plagiarizing himself, but did he not realize that his quotation from Mark Twain had been anticipated by Blaise Pascal, and his quotation from Freud was translation of a phrase from Augustine of Hippo? One suspects that both Twain and Freud were well aware of what they were doing. One suspects also that the letter writer had to do some checking. Reminds me, as all things do, of a New Yorker cartoon from eons ago, with someone sitting at his desk typing out an irate letter to the editor, and the caption is, "The writer of such and such gets this quote wrong, if memory serves me correctly," but in the cartoon he has a reference work open right in front of him because he's not using his memory. But anyway, we move on from there. This is this issue has a concentration on European literature, which makes it slightly less interesting to me than other concentrations would be in other issues. Not because I'm an American troglodyte, but because in recent years, in the last 10, 15 years, I've sort of concentrated on American literature. Not literature of Americans, but stuff coming out in the American publishing world. Every year. I do an enormous amount of that. I read more of those books across a broader spectrum than I believe any reader, certainly any critic, anywhere in the English-speaking world. And as long as I'm going to be doing that, so much time every day spent on that, then I tend to draw the line and not go afield to elsewhere, to Europe, even in English, to other countries in other languages. I've sort of circumscribed a patch of territory that I use, that I concentrate on. So this European literature, most of it I don't know, and most of it I won't know, unless it comes to America in a translation or an American edition, and then I will make it my business to learn about it. But there was a very long, this is also 6 columns, this is also 2 full pages, a long piece by Ben Hutchinson on George Steiner, the critic who just died. Now, George Steiner and I agreed on absolutely nothing. Nothing whatsoever, especially the role and nature of the critic itself. But this was still a fantastic piece. Just fantastic. I looked in vain in the TLS for this exact kind of thing. 6 columns, long, intelligent, well done appreciation of Clive James. Looked in vain for it. TLS didn't do it. The most they allowed as any kind of a posthumous mention of this person who did so much for them over so long a time was a snarky comment by their chronicler, their columnist, J.C., in the back of one issue, and that was it. There weren't any other appreciations of anything like this length, and that's a little bit of a shame. But anyway, the issue goes on, and all of these early pages are devoted to European literature, so they had less interest for me, but because I don't know how many of these things are going to come to America. I have no idea. I'm curious to know. But when we get in the middle of the TLS, there's an essay. There's always an essay. And this one is by a French author, I believe, Anne Serre, S-E-R-R-E. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, but her essay is called Alone with a Night Watchman. And I started reading it, and I was thinking, this is really good. This is very engaging. Apparently, The Beginners, her 3rd book, will be translated to English and published in the autumn. So maybe I will see The Beginners by this author at some point down the line. But then I got to a paragraph that just stopped me cold. That just made me stare at the page, in the way that a writer will do when they suddenly speak a truth of your own reality that you just didn't see coming. So I want to read you the beginning. I want to read you the start of this essay. 40 years ago, I was in my final year at the Lycée Portier in Orléans when my father was the deputy headmaster. We had a staff apartment overlooking the Rue Marcel Proust. On weekdays, the school was full of pupils, but on Sundays there was nobody, and the place would become, for my sisters and me, our home. The fact that the enormous school was empty, with its long, wide, empty corridors, its empty classrooms, its empty chemistry labs, sick bay, and canteen, had something at once magical and erotic about it. On Sundays, in the oppressive emptiness of the afternoon, I would sneak off down the huge avenues of the place in search of in secret, for our father, of course, had forbidden us from roaming through the corridors. Sometimes I would run into a strange man who was the night watchman. He was strange inasmuch as he was very distinguished and spoke the language of an immaculately groomed early 20th century manservant. He would address my father, for example, exclusively in the 3rd person, saying, "If Monsieur the deputy headmaster has no objections, I shall do such and such," or whatnot. He also had a wonderful name, which unfortunately I have forgotten. A name very similar to that of Marcel Proust's maid, who was called Celeste. The night watchman at the Lycée was not called Celeste, but he had a name that was equally unexpected. As I was writing this paragraph, I said to myself, I must ask my father the name of the night watchman. My father, however, has been dead for 6 years. So I shall have to ask one of my sisters what that remarkably distinguished night watchman was called. But today my 2 sisters are also dead. So here I am, all alone with the night watchman, and with nobody left to help me find his name. And this, in a way, is the sort of thing literature does. It's the sort of thing you do when you write a novel, when you're a novelist. You search for a name you've forgotten and which nobody can tell you anymore. I don't know why, but that really hit me. That really did. I know that quite a few of you are young, so you might not have any idea what the author is getting at here, but it's viscerally true. And it's amazing when it happens to you. Absolutely amazing. I read those lines and was just stunned to realize. All of a sudden, I flashed back to a time 50 years ago, 40 years ago, when I was at an after party for a play, an off-Broadway play in New York. I used to go to New York every weekend from Boston. Almost every weekend I used to go. It was cheap to do, and the whole world was happening in New York, on Broadway and off Broadway. I was always a long list of things to do. There was the Strand and a million other bookstores. There were record shops. There was opera, stage plays, musicals, concerts of all kinds. So I went pretty much every weekend, and I went to an off-Broadway play that I didn't particularly like that much, but I was urged by the friend I went with to go to the after party, and I spotted a young man at the after party of this play, and I noticed him right away, and he apparently noticed me right away, and we found ourselves talking, and excluding the party. We found ourselves just sort of concentrating on each other and talking until everybody was ready to go. And over the next few weeks, we found a reason to meet each other in New York pretty much every weekend. And after a while, after a month or two, he was the reason why I was going to New York City on the weekend, and all of the events, all of that world happening stuff that I was talking about was the stuff we were going to do. But it wouldn't have mattered to me if we did none of it. And he was all I thought about during the week. When I was doing the things I had to do and spending time with the people I spent time with, he was still what I thought about. I always looked forward to my weekends in New York. I took good care to make sure that my beagles were well cared for while I was gone, so they were off my mind as much as they could be. They were healthy. And we did all sorts of things. We went to record stores and just flipped through the records and talked about our musical experiences in all of the sections. He knew everything there was to know about rock and roll, punk music, that sort of thing. And he knew a surprising amount about opera, and I knew a lot about classical literature and classical music, and we would talk all about those things. And we would be walking down the long, those of you who've never walked around the streets of Manhattan, we would walk around the streets of Manhattan at sunset. He had a rat trap of a one-room cold water walk-up that I'm sure would now be $750,000 a year to own. I'm sure that is a coveted space now, but then it was barely any money at all. It was all that he had. And that was where I stayed. I didn't stay with friends in the city anymore. I stayed with him. And we would walk down the streets at sunset when the sunset in Manhattan, because of the way the streets are laid out, is glorious. That hour is just glorious. And we would joke and laugh, sometimes just run together side by side for random intervals for no reason whatsoever. I made fun of him for his reading choices. He made fun of me for the fact that when we were out and about on Manhattan streets, every single dog that we came across in dog walking time wanted time with me, and I wanted time with them. And we fell in love. We fell in love. And he was beautiful. And he was all mine. And that was every weekend for a long, long time. And he went on. He went on and wrote a couple of novels and short stories. And then he died. He died in the first ravages of the AIDS epidemic, when no one knew what it was, when it seemed to be everywhere, when it seemed to be the absolute death knell of an entire section of the world, an entire section certainly of our world. And I mourned him, of course, and then, you know, I went on living. And this paragraph reminded me. I read it and thought, well, okay, there was a used bookstore. We used to go there practically every weekend that we were together. No matter what else we were doing, we would go to this used bookstore. It was this ratty place. It was full of books. And we were usually the only people there, and the proprietor would just let us sit on the floor in the midst of all of these books with the cats roaming all around. And we would sit and we would look at the books and we would talk and we would read out loud. The proprietor, I don't think, minded at all. I think he knew that we were everything to each other and just wanted to smile and get out of the way. And this, when I was reading this paragraph, I thought, boy, oh boy, I wonder if that proprietor knows the name of my friend. I wonder if he remembers the name of my friend. And then I remembered, the proprietor is long dead, and the shop is long gone, and the block is long gone. There is no trace at all of those memories. None. They're gone. There is no one to ask. Unlike this author, who I would imagine, in next week's TLS, I would imagine that there will be 4 or 5 letters saying, I remember that night watchman, this was his name, here's where his widow lives, these are his grandchildren. There isn't any way for me to do this. There isn't any way at all. There isn't any way for me, even if I tried as hard as I could, to dig back and find those things. They're gone. I can't go back to that space. I can't ever get back to that person. I was with him when he got the mother of all bridge-burning letters from his father. The type of thing you think is only written that way and only exists in fiction, but it doesn't. It doesn't. I felt the blows of it just shivering through his back. I had my hand on his back while he was reading it, sitting on the floor. I felt every paragraph. I was reading it with him, and every paragraph was worse than the one before, and I could feel them. I could feel the impact they were having go through his body. So even if his family does still exist, and I bet they don't, I bet they don't, it was his parents, and that's all. And they were getting on in years even then. Even if they did exist, they wouldn't know me, and there's no way. There's no way that I will ever recover what we had. All that time, all those things that we did, those albums are gone, the bookstore is gone, the building is gone, the eyewitnesses are gone, the restaurants where we ate and had such fun, all gone. The blocks, the buildings, gone. So Alone with the Night Watchman, I might read when it comes out, because it's an experience that I have, and I could record it a number of different times. That is not the only example of an irretrievable and unreclaimable past. Anyway, that struck me, and that was right in the middle of this TLS. But there was one other thing that I wanted to mention. What was it? There was one other thing that I wanted to bring up. Oh no, there were 2 things. There were 2 things. The TLS regularly does. They regularly do a reprint from the archives, and because they started the issue with a review of A New Life of Patrick O'Brian, in this issue their reprint is John Mullen reviewing The Yellow Admiral by Patrick O'Brian, one of his final Aubrey and Maturin novels. And boy, oh boy, is it a bad review. It's just totally tone deaf. I remember it. Once I got part of the way into it, I remembered reading it in the TLS. The author spends the first 3 or 4 long paragraphs of the review talking about how recondite and weird and obscure the vocabulary is in Patrick O'Brian's seafaring novels, and then actually says that the obscurity and the weirdness of the vocabulary is largely the point of those novels. And I'm thinking, no, it's not. What on earth? Are you some sort of moron? You're thinking just because you can say that makes it true? That doesn't make it true. That's not true at all. And then he goes on to say that what is it? While the information in the books is dense, the characterization is primitive. Aubrey and Maturin scarcely exist except to voice knowledge and exhibit wearying abilities. As well as being founts of data, both are Regency versions of Renaissance men. Aubrey is a brilliant sailor, campaigning politician, self-educated bibliophile, expert musician, freer of slaves, and one of his country's leading mathematicians. And so on. Maturin gets a similar condescending paragraph of inaccuracies, that is just inaccurate. There's just a wrong way to characterize this. And it made me realize that this was just the wrong person reviewing a book. And who knows how many people were influenced by this? Who knows how many people, by the time The Yellow Admiral came out, were actually considering, I've now heard from everybody at my bookstore, at my book club, all of my reading friends, about this Patrick O'Brian guy. Maybe it's time that I started reading his books. I was like that. I learned about this author through word of mouth before I tried him at all. How many of those people were thinking that and were on the fence and then read this review and thought, oh, that sounds terrible, and naturally inferred from the review that all the books were like that? Well, that is not the case. Even with Yellow Admiral, that is not the case. So that was kind of frustrating. And there was one other frustrating thing in here to wrap this tedious little excursion up. And it also came from JC's column in the back. But in this case, I'm not irritated with JC. This reminded me of an irritation that I experienced on social media, of all places, which I almost never talk about on this channel. Because he's talking, or she, whoever JC is, they're talking about a controversy that erupted in the publishing world. And it was reflected on Twitter. I want to read you the part of this that is about Woody Allen. When Woody Allen's latest film failed to find a distributor, we did not speak. referring to Martin Niemöller's famous saying, what is it here? First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Ending finally with, and then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And that's what they mean by, first they got Woody Allen's movie, and we did not speak out. That is the conceit here of this beginning thing. But now it's about a book. Staff at Hachette in New York staged a walkout last week over plans by Grand Central, a Hachette imprint, to publish Allen's memoir, Apropos of Nothing. That's the title of the memoir. Originally scheduled for release next month. Chiefs at Hachette first resisted, then yielded to what is, in effect, a mob. It is a genteel mob, well-educated, non-violent, but convinced of its righteousness. A statement issued by employees of Hachette said, quote, "We stand in solidarity with Ronan Farrow, Dylan Farrow, and survivors of sexual assault," close quote. But Allen was investigated on 2 occasions over allegations made by Ronan and Dylan Farrow and has not been charged with any offense. I want to underscore that before we go on, that is a decidedly soft way of putting that. In American jurisprudence, in the only law system that we have in this country, Woody Allen is innocent. He's innocent because he has not been proven guilty. He hasn't even been charged. Anyway, it is hard to argue with a mob, and harder still with a historically ignorant mob. Freedom to write and publish has been fought for by bold members of the publishing profession for centuries, up to recent times. The blacklisting in the U.S. of the 1950s of screenwriters who were alleged conspiring with the communists ruined careers, even though some were not guilty, even by association. The most common modern form of censorship involves writing about sex. Again, thanks to publishers in Paris, New York, and London willing to stand for freedom of speech, the public gained the right to read books that are now considered to be classics. Whose book would you like to see struck off next? Which speaker shall we cancel? Each of us has, in our more heated moments, had a candidate. It shouldn't be allowed. A moment's reflection reminds us that people who have not been convicted of criminal offenses deserve to live and work without interference from the moral majority. Now, who knows what kind of response JC will get for that. This is an opinionated writer, so the responses are often fill the next week's letters page. But this controversy came up on Twitter. And I happened to wade into it on Twitter, and I was astounded, but I was also, I have to say, deeply disappointed. And it was so surprising. That adds to the disappointment, is that it caught me completely by surprise. How many booktubers were on Twitter in this thread of argumentation in favor of censorship, in favor of Hachette canceling Woody Allen's contract? Because a handful of employees said, this is bad. And you know, in the story on Twitter and in this version of it in JC's column, the one very active element, the actual element that made the officials at Hachette change their mind, is not being mentioned. We all know it. We all know what that element is, but we're not mentioning it. I think in the Twitter thread that I joined, I was the only one to mention, to even allude to it. And that is the fact that these Hachette employees and their friends weren't just protesting, they were threatening. They were threatening Hachette with dragging on social media to ruin the whole company if they didn't get what they want. They weren't just, oh, it's protesting and maybe Channel 6 will have a minute on our protest late in the broadcast. No. They were planning on piety mobbing Hachette. They were planning on ruining it on trying to destroy it completely the way piety mobs do on social media. And for some reason, companies whose most powerful executives up on the C level couldn't identify Twitter out of a police lineup are terrified of that kind of mean girl name calling on this social media platform that they never visit and that has nothing to do with their bottom line. They're terrified of it. They capitulate to it immediately. But one way or another, whether that would ever have happened or not, I had booktubers, dedicated, open-minded book readers on Twitter coming out in favor of censorship, saying, well, you know, he can always publish somewhere else. As if that's the point, not even seeming to realize what they were talking about, what they were championing. And that was bad enough, and the extra cherry of bad on the top of all that was that a lot of my non-booktube friends, a lot of my real-world bookish friends who've always been a little bit dubious about this experiment of booktube on my part, were watching and just sending me DMs and emails saying, oh, who are these people? These are the people you've been praising and saying are so much fun for all these years? For the last 4 years, you've been saying there's a whole category of a whole atmosphere, a whole world, an arena of book readers that you don't know anything about. And I may have a lot to do with them, and I think they're fantastic. These are those people? This thread is entirely full of people defending censorship. And it was rough. It was very rough, because my standard line when that comes up is, you have to draw, I say you have to draw a distinction between, you know, the professional world of letters and passionate readers for whom it is nevertheless a pastime. And I also often would resort to, you know, a lot of the people on this platform are young. A lot of the creators, the content creators on this platform are young, and maybe their morals are still forming, or maybe they haven't had a horrible example, and so they don't know. They haven't had their virtue signaling checked by anything real world or anything like that. And there wasn't anything I could do in this time. I just had to apologize to these non-booktube friends. I just had to apologize to say, yeah, it's surprising me as much as it's surprising you. I did not know these people liked censorship. I didn't know they were in favor of it. Conducted against, and let me underscore this again, an innocent person. Because you can't be guilty in America unless a court convicts you. Guilt in the court of public opinion means nothing. The court of public opinion is the high school lunchroom. Do you want your life to be ruled by the high school lunchroom? I don't. No, you're not guilty until you're proven guilty, until you're assessed as guilty by a jury of your peers. So that whole thing on Twitter just astonished me and dismayed me. I didn't quite recover my bearings for a few days after that, because it's weird to learn that about people who you like. I've never met these people, of course. We've never met each other. Any of us have. But I've watched their channels, the ones who had channels. I've watched their channels, the ones who didn't have channels. They have Twitter accounts. I've watched their Twitter account and often read their work. And I will still do that. I will still read so-and-so when, you know, his freelance piece shows up in New Criterion or whatever. I will still watch the channels of the booktubers who are weighing in favor of censorship. Maybe he can just get another publisher, or maybe he can self-publish. As if that has anything to do with anything. As if that has anything to do with the question at all. It doesn't have anything to do with the question at all. He could put on a rubber mask and go to Buenos Aires and have somebody translate the work into Spanish and publish it under a pseudonym. Sure, he could. No one's arguing that. There was a deal in place. There was a book in galleys. I couldn't make that point. I couldn't get it through to any of the readers and the booktubers who were in this debate on social media. And I will still watch those channels, but it's weird. I have, since then, watched videos by some of the people in those exchanges, and it's weird to watch their videos and hear, you know, very open-minded, very, you know, my reading is my life type notes struck, and to know now that that is not the case. That that's a case up to a certain point, and then after that, no, after that I do want your book burned. When the point I was trying to make in my own response, until I just got so frustrated and was so mortified, because I was kept getting sarcastic DMs and emails from people in publishing, from long-standing published authors, from old friends of mine, old critics, saying, yeah, I love that last point that so-and-so made. Yeah, these are your friends. I eventually just had to walk away from the whole thing. But the point I was trying to make is that this is not a scale. It cannot be a scale. It cannot be. If you're going to get published, then that's that. And if you're outraged at the book, there are all sorts of things to do about that once the book comes out. But mobbing the publisher and getting them to pull the book that they have contracted to publish is not. That is censorship. That is a tiny, tiny fragment of the reading population using weaponized self-righteousness to determine what the rest of the reading population can read. And it absolutely is not a response to what I just said to say, well, you could publish somewhere else. We can self-publish. That absolutely is not a response, and I couldn't get anybody to see that. And it's reflected now in the TLS. Wonderful. There's no escape for me. So that was the TLS. This is the date on this is March 13th, 2020. That was the date that this went to the presses. And the same thing was true of Harper's and of the New Republic and Time Magazine and National Geographic. All of these had early March or mid-March print dates, all these magazines and newspapers that I get in the mail, and it is a weird feeling to know this is the very last time. Maybe not the TLS, because they have a lot of stuff that's in bed, that's done and set long ahead of time. But for the rest of those were the last issues that I read in the old world. Everything from now on will be in the new world. And that was weird. That was very weird to think that all of those things, the next time they come here to Hyde Cottage, will be firmly planted in the new world, where we're all living now, as opposed to the old world that we were living in when those things were printed. That is weird. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. This went on too long. Sorry about that. A couple of rants in there and a little sentimental journey down the middle. We'll do it every time. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.